You're a burden. I sold your father's company. Good luck paying your rent, my son said. I just smiled slightly and answered calmly that if that was his decision, then all I could say was all right and wish him good luck as well. When they landed in Milan and checked their bank accounts, everything began to change. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and write the city you're watching from so I can see how far it has reached. I was arranging fresh lilies in the crystal vase when I heard Wade Sullivan's car pull into the driveway. The sound of his BMW engine always made my stomach tighten lately. He only visited when he needed something, and it had been 3 months since our last conversation. Through the window, I watched him step out of the driver's seat, adjusting his expensive suit jacket. Brittany Cole followed, her heels clicking against the pavement as she smoothed her blonde hair. Even from a distance, I could see the determined look on her face. Whatever they came for, she was clearly the one pushing it. The doorbell rang twice, sharp and impatient. I set the vase down and walked slowly to the front door, my heart already expecting disappointment. When I opened it, Wade Sullivan barely looked at me. He greeted me briefly and stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He said they needed to talk. Brittany walked past me, her perfume filling the small entryway. She carried a leather briefcase, holding it tightly in her hands. She greeted me with that overly sweet tone that always made me uncomfortable. I led them into the living room, the same one where Wade Sullivan had taken his first steps 35 years ago. Now he stood in the middle of it like a stranger, arms crossed, looking anywhere but at me. I offered them coffee and mentioned that I had just made a fresh pot, trying to keep things normal. Wade Sullivan immediately said this wasn't a social visit. His voice colder than I had ever heard before. He told me to sit down because there was something important I needed to hear. My legs felt weak as I sat down in my favorite armchair, the one Harold and I had chosen together 40 years ago. Brittany Cole sat across from me and opened her briefcase slowly and carefully. Wade Sullivan remained standing, towering over us. Then he said it, the company was sold. The words hit me like a physical blow. I asked what he meant. Brittany Cole pulled out a thick stack of papers and placed them on the table. She explained that the sale went through yesterday morning, and that Wade Sullivan had been handling everything for months. I stared at the documents, my vision slightly blurred. The company Harold and I had built from nothing, the one that had supported our family for decades, was gone. I quietly said that I was still the majority shareholder. Wade Sullivan let out a short, harsh laugh and said I hadn't been involved in daily operations for 3 years, not since his father died, and that I didn't understand the financial side anymore. I said that wasn't true, but my voice sounded small even to me. Brittany Cole pointed out my situation, the house, the bills that stayed on the counter for weeks, the forgotten appointments. She added that just last month I had called Wade Sullivan 3 times in one day, asking about the same thing. I felt heat rise in my cheeks. It was true I had been calling more often since Harold's death, but not because I was confused. It was because I was lonely and missed having someone to share decisions with. Wade Sullivan pulled up a chair and sat directly in front of me, leaning forward. He said I was 64 years old and had been struggling since his father passed. The company, in his opinion, needed younger leadership and fresh ideas. I said the company was profitable and that the reports showed it. He interrupted, saying those reports reflected what his father had built years ago, and that the industry had changed: technology, automation, digital marketing, things I didn't understand. Brittany Cole nodded and said they weren't trying to hurt me but to protect me. She explained the buyer paid well above market value, and that the money would keep me comfortable for the rest of my life. I looked at them, trying to see the son I had raised, the boy who used to climb into my lap during storms. But instead, I saw a man looking at me with impatience. I quietly asked how much. They exchanged a glance, and Wade Sullivan said the amount, $2.8 million. After taxes and fees, he added, I would have about $1.9 million in my account by Friday. It was a good price, more than good. But the money wasn't the point. I said they had sold our company without even asking me. Wade Sullivan said he was asking now, and that I needed to sign the papers to make it official and confirm it was in my best interest. Brittany Cole leaned forward again, speaking softly, suggesting a simpler life. No meetings, no stress, just my garden, books, and maybe travel. Wade Sullivan stood up suddenly and walked to the window. When he turned back, his face was hard. He said the truth was that I was a burden and had been ever since his father died. He talked about my constant calls, my questions, and how I doubted his decisions, saying I didn't understand the modern world. The word burden hung in the air like smoke. I felt something inside me crack. Not break, but crack like ice beginning to thaw. He said he sold his father's company because it was the right thing to do, for the business, for the employees, and for me. He added that I should think about paying rent for a new place, because this house would cost more than I could afford on a fixed income. Brittany Cole shot him a warning look, but he ignored it. I said quietly that he was my son, more to myself than to him. And he replied that I was his mother, which was why he was doing this. He added that someone had to make the hard decisions, and clearly it wasn't going to be me. I sat in that chair for what felt like hours, though in reality it was probably only a few minutes. My mind felt strangely calm, almost like the quiet center of a storm. When I finally looked up, both Wade Sullivan and Brittany Cole were watching me, clearly expecting some kind of reaction. I simply said that it was okay and wished him good luck. Wade Sullivan blinked, confused, asking what I meant. I repeated calmly that everything was fine and that I wished him good luck. I stood up slowly, smoothing my skirt, and said that I assumed they needed my signature on the papers, asking where exactly I should sign. Brittany Cole hesitated for a moment, clearly expecting resistance, then pointed at the documents and showed me where to sign and where to put my initials. I signed everything they indicated. My handwriting remained steady, even though I could feel a tremor somewhere deep inside. When I finished, I handed the pen back to Brittany Cole and walked toward the front door. Wade Sullivan called after me, surprised, asking if that was really it and whether I wasn't going to argue or try to make him feel guilty about family. I turned back to him, my hand resting on the doorknob, and asked calmly whether that would change anything at all. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. I answered for him, saying that I didn't think it would. Then I wished them a wonderful time in Milan, and added that I hoped the weather would be nice for their honeymoon. Brittany Cole looked at me with surprise and asked how I knew about Milan. For the first time since they arrived, I smiled and told her that I knew more than they thought. After they left, I returned to my armchair and slowly looked around the living room. Everything looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Yet somehow everything felt completely different. The silence had changed too. It no longer felt empty, but almost expectant, like the quiet just before sunrise. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. I told Marcus Reed that it was Agatha Doyle, and that it was finally time to have that conversation. Marcus Reed arrived within an hour, carrying the same worn leather satchel he had been using since I first met him 25 years ago. My longtime attorney, and more importantly my friend, looked just as I expected, concerned but not surprised. He said he assumed Wade Sullivan had gone through with it. I confirmed that everything had happened exactly as we had predicted. I poured him coffee from the pot I had made earlier, my hands now steadier than they had been in months, and told him that Wade Sullivan had called me a burden, repeating his exact words. Marcus Reed shook his head, his gray eyebrows tightening, and said he was sorry. He added that even though we had prepared for this, it still must have hurt. I sat across from him, holding my cup, and said that the pain had stopped surprising me years ago. What surprised me now was how predictable Wade Sullivan had become. Marcus Reed suggested that we review the timeline and pulled out a thick folder from his satchel. I nodded, even though I already knew every detail by heart. We had been preparing for this for 3 years, ever since Harold's funeral, when Wade Sullivan had quietly suggested that I should step back from business responsibilities. I began explaining that everything started in 1983, when Harold and I were both 25, just out of college and completely broke. I had a business degree and many ideas, while he had charisma and the ability to attract investors. Marcus Reed smiled and said it was the classic combination, though most people assumed Harold was the real mind behind everything. I set my cup down softly and said that the bank loans were approved because of his charm, and early partnerships happened because people preferred dealing with him. So we played along with those expectations. I walked to the desk and took out a framed photograph from the drawer. It showed Harold and me at the opening of our first office building. He stood in front, smiling at the camera, while I stood slightly behind, observing everything. I said quietly that I was always watching. While Harold spoke with people, I was analyzing who truly had influence, who was just talking, and which deals would actually work. Marcus Reed then mentioned the company structure. I explained that officially Harold owned 60% and I owned 40%, but the real control was hidden in the subsidiary companies, trusts, and intellectual property, all things I had created and managed. I opened another drawer filled with documents Wade Sullivan had never seen. When Wade Sullivan joined the company 8 years ago, Harold was already showing signs of heart problems, so we began planning ahead. Marcus Reed put on his glasses and mentioned the Meridian Trust. I confirmed that this was when we created it. 70% of the real value of the company, patents, international contracts, and properties, had been moved into that trust, with me as the sole beneficiary. The remaining 30%, including daily operations and the company name, stayed in the main structure. Marcus Reed asked if Wade Sullivan knew any of this. I let out a quiet laugh and said that Wade Sullivan only knew what he wanted to know. He had always been focused on proving himself, on showing he could run everything better, but he never asked the right questions. The sunlight was now coming through the windows, lighting up tiny particles of dust in the air. I remembered another afternoon about a year ago, when I overheard Wade Sullivan speaking on the phone in Harold's office. I told Marcus Reed that Wade Sullivan had been talking to Brittany Cole, and she was asking about the company's assets and whether I had any real control. Wade Sullivan had laughed and said I was just a figurehead and didn't really understand the business side. Marcus Reed made a note and said that was when I decided to speed things up. I said that was the moment I realized my son had never truly known me. I returned to my chair and said that for 35 years, I had been the one behind the curtain. I said that for years I had let Harold take credit for my ideas and allowed Wade Sullivan to believe I was just his scatterbrained mother who needed protection. Marcus Reed asked quietly why I had done that, a question he had asked many times before. I explained that I thought it was what they needed from me. I slowly traced the rim of my coffee cup with my finger. Harold needed to feel that the success was his, that it belonged to him because his pride depended on it. And Wade Sullivan needed to believe he was the one saving me from my own incompetence, because it gave him a sense of purpose. But Harold always knew the truth. He really did. My voice softened when I said that. I told Marcus Reed that the night before Harold died, he made me promise something. He told me not to let Wade Sullivan take advantage of my kindness the same way he had, and that I needed to make sure Wade Sullivan understood my real value. Marcus Reed leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully, as someone who knew me well enough to read between every word. He pointed out that now Wade Sullivan had sold what he believed was the entire company for $2.8 million. I smiled, and this time there was clear humor in it. I explained that what Wade Sullivan didn't realize was that he had only sold about 30% of the real value, essentially just the outer shell. The Meridian Trust holdings, based on yesterday's valuation, were worth around $9.2 million. I took out a financial statement from the drawer and showed him. The patents alone were worth $4 million. The commercial properties in Houston and Phoenix added another $3.5 million. And the international distribution rights made up the rest. Marcus Reed let out a quiet whistle and said Wade Sullivan had absolutely no idea. I agreed, saying Wade Sullivan had spent the last 3 years telling me I didn't understand modern business. Maybe he was right, I said calmly. I didn't understand how someone could sell a profitable company without properly checking its real assets. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Harold and I had planted together. I asked Marcus Reed if he knew what Wade Sullivan had told me last Christmas, that I was living in the past and needed to accept that the business world had moved beyond what a woman of my generation could understand. Marcus Reed asked what I had said in response. I told him I had agreed. Then I added that right after that, I closed 3 new international deals and increased our patent portfolio by 40%. Marcus Reed closed his folder and leaned forward, asking what would happen next. I told him that now we would simply wait for Wade Sullivan and Brittany Cole to arrive in Milan. They were staying at the Palazzo Parigi in the presidential suite, which I had booked for them myself as a wedding gift. I added that I had paid for it using company funds that technically no longer existed, from an account Wade Sullivan believed held his inheritance. I admitted I felt a small sense of anticipation. I explained that the account would show a zero balance when they tried to access it the next morning. Marcus Reed mentioned the number of calls Wade Sullivan might make. I laughed quietly and said that 53 calls was just an estimate, and knowing Wade Sullivan, it could easily be more. Marcus Reed packed his documents but didn't stand up yet. He asked if I was sure about all of this, reminding me that once everything unfolded, there would be no going back with Wade Sullivan. I thought about his question carefully. Was I really ready to lose my son completely just to make him understand who I truly was? In the end, I said that I had already lost my son the moment he decided I was a burden, and everything that followed was simply me taking back my dignity. After Marcus Reed left, I sat alone in the house, which now felt more like home than it had in years. I picked up my phone and found the number I needed. I called Carla Bennett and told her it was Agatha Doyle, admitting it had been a while, and said I had a proposition for her. I asked how she would feel about running a company again. As I spoke, explaining my plans to expand the business Wade Sullivan had unknowingly given away, I realized something inside me had shifted. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like myself again, the real version of me. The woman who had built everything while everyone assumed she was just handling small things in the background. Tomorrow, Wade Sullivan would finally understand the difference. Whether he could accept that truth was another question. The first call came exactly at 6 a.m. Milan time, which was 5 a.m. where I was sitting in my kitchen with a cup of chamomile tea, already awake. I had been counting the hours, knowing they would try to access the money as soon as possible. I let the phone ring. The second call came 3 minutes later, then another. By the fifth call, my phone was vibrating so strongly on the table that it nearly fell. I answered on the sixth ring. I calmly greeted Wade Sullivan. His voice sounded tense, almost panicked beneath an attempt to stay controlled. He said there was a problem with the bank accounts and that the money from the sale was not showing up. I slowly took a sip of tea and said that was strange, asking if he had contacted the bank. He said of course he had, already losing control of his tone. He explained that the bank told him the account had been closed the previous afternoon. He asked how an account could just be closed like that. I answered calmly that I wouldn't know, since banking had never really been my area of expertise, as he had reminded me many times. There was a pause and I could hear Brittany Cole's voice in the background, sharp and demanding. Wade Sullivan covered the phone, but I could still make out her words telling him to tell me to fix it right now. Then his voice came back, more controlled, but with an edge I had never heard before. He said I needed to call Marcus Reed, because there was obviously some kind of mistake with the paperwork and the sale money should have been deposited yesterday. I answered pleasantly that I would call him in the morning, reminding him it was still early here, and that whatever it was could wait until business hours. He snapped immediately, saying it couldn't wait. He said they were in Milan, that they had reservations and plans, and that he had paid for a suite at one of the most expensive hotels in Europe. He added that their cards weren't working either. I made a small sympathetic sound with my tongue and said that did sound inconvenient, adding that I hoped they had brought some cash for emergencies. The line went quiet except for the sound of Wade Sullivan's breathing, which was becoming more uneven. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously low. He said he would ask me once more and needed me to listen carefully, telling me to call Marcus Reed right now and find out where their money was. Our money. I repeated the phrase slowly, almost tasting each word, and said I didn't remember us having any joint accounts. He clarified, saying it was the money from the sale, his inheritance, the $2.8 million that should be in his account right now. I set down my teacup carefully and said that I knew exactly where that money was. I heard him exhale in relief and immediately say to call Marcus Reed. I answered simply that it was in my account. The silence that followed was complete, so much that for a moment I thought the call had dropped. Then his voice came back, barely above a whisper, asking what I had just said. I repeated that the money was in my account, where it had always been and where it would stay. The reaction came instantly. He demanded to know what I was talking about, saying he had sold the company and had all the paperwork, including my signature. I calmly confirmed that yes, he had sold the company, and yes, I had signed the papers. I explained that what he sold was 30% of Herald Industries for $2.8 million, which was actually a good price for what he owned. I could hear Brittany Cole now, her voice getting closer, asking what I was saying. Wade Sullivan told me to stop playing games, his voice shaking now, saying I couldn't do this because the company had been his father's and now it was his. I corrected him, saying the company name had belonged to his father, and the daily operations, payroll, and office lease in Austin were his to sell, and he did. Then I congratulated him. He stopped abruptly, and I could tell he was starting to understand. He asked where the rest was. I finished the thought for him, explaining that the patents, international contracts, commercial real estate, and manufacturing rights had never been part of what he inherited. Those had always been mine. There was a noise and then Brittany Cole took the phone. She introduced herself and said there must be some misunderstanding. I greeted her politely and asked how the weather was in Milan. She ignored that and insisted I was claiming assets that belonged to Wade Sullivan, saying it wasn't legally possible because she had seen the incorporation papers. I corrected her, saying she had only seen what Wade Sullivan chose to show her. I asked if she had reviewed the Meridian Trust documents, the subsidiary structures, or the intellectual property filings. Her silence gave me the answer. I said that when you spend 40 years building a business, you learn to protect your interests, and that the most valuable assets are often not written openly. Wade Sullivan came back on the line, and now there was clear fear in his voice. He said I couldn't do this and reminded me that he was my son and that we were family. I answered that yes, we were family, which was exactly why he felt comfortable calling me a burden and selling what he believed was my life's work without asking me. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window, watching the sunrise begin to color the sky. I asked him if he really thought I was so unaware that I wouldn't understand what he was doing. He said he wasn't planning anything and that he was trying to help me. I replied that he was trying to help himself to what he thought was an easy inheritance, counting on me being the helpless woman he believed I was. Brittany Cole took the phone again and said this was elder abuse, and that they would sue me for everything I had. I laughed softly and asked with what money and which lawyers, since they were standing in a hotel lobby in Milan without access to funds. Wade Sullivan came back on the line and said they would figure it out. He said he would call everyone he knew, including his father's old business partners, and that they would loan him the money to fight this. I asked if he meant the business partners whose contracts were now void, because the company they partnered with no longer existed in any meaningful form, or perhaps the ones currently negotiating more profitable deals with Meridian Trust. The sound that came through the phone was somewhere between a growl and a sob. He said I had planned all of this. I corrected him, saying I had prepared for it. There was a difference. I told him I had hoped he would prove me wrong, that he would show me he valued our relationship more than what he could take from me. He said he did value our relationship. I answered that he valued what he thought the relationship could give him, and that there was a difference there as well. I could hear hotel lobby sounds in the background, voices speaking fast Italian, and the clear sound of an elevator. They were trying to deal with everything in public. He asked quietly how long I had known. I asked what exactly he meant. He clarified. How long had I known he was going to sell the company? For a moment I thought about lying, making it seem recent, but decided he deserved the truth. I said 3 years. Since the week after his father's funeral, when he told me I should start thinking about stepping back from business responsibilities. He repeated it quietly, 3 years. 3 years of watching him move closer step by step, of listening to him and Brittany Cole whisper about my memory, my abilities, my age. 3 years of preparing for this exact moment. Brittany Cole's voice came through again, louder now, almost panicked. She said they couldn't stay there without money and would be thrown out of the hotel. I said I was sure they would find a way. After all, they were much more capable than I was. A small problem like being stuck in Europe without money should not be difficult for people with their business skills. Wade Sullivan's voice broke slightly as he spoke. He said he had made a mistake and understood that now, and asked what he needed to do to fix it. For a moment I felt that old instinct, the urge to help him to fix everything like before. But then I remembered sitting in my living room and hearing him call me a burden. I told him he could start by figuring out how to get home from Milan without my help and treat it as a lesson in solving problems. He said I couldn't just leave them there. I said I wasn't leaving him, only letting him experience independence. The same independence he wanted from his burden of a mother. The line went quiet again, except for his breathing. When he spoke, his voice was smaller, almost defeated. He asked what happens now. I said that now he would learn what I had always known, that family is not just about blood but about respect. And respect is not something you inherit, Wade Sullivan. It is something you earn. I ended the call and turned off the ringer. By my count, that had been call number 13. If I was right, there would be many more. I made myself a fresh cup of tea and sat back at the kitchen table with my tablet. There were emails to read, decisions to make, and a company to run, the real one, the one that had always been mine. Outside, the world was waking up to a new day. By noon, my phone showed 37 missed calls. I turned the ringer back on later, curious how his tone would change as things became more serious. It changed exactly as expected. From confusion to anger to pleading to threats and back again. Brittany Cole's voice appeared more often, no longer polite, but sharp and demanding. I was in the garden, trimming the roses Harold had planted for our 20th anniversary, when the next call came. This time I answered immediately. I greeted Wade Sullivan. His voice sounded tired as he said they needed to talk properly, not on the phone but face to face, and that they were coming home. I paused thinking about that. I asked with what money, reminding him his cards were not working. He said he had called his uncle Robert Hayes, who was sending money for tickets. I noted that was resourceful. He said they would be back the next evening and asked if I would be home. I said it was my home and of course I would be there. There was a short pause. Then he said he would fight this legally, and that he couldn't allow me to destroy his father's legacy out of spite. I repeated slowly, his father's legacy. I asked Wade Sullivan what he believed his father's legacy actually was. He answered that it was the company, the business he had built from nothing. I corrected him, saying we built it from nothing, his father and I together, though I understood why he might forget that detail. He said fine, we built it, but that didn't change the fact that I was destroying it now. I set down my pruning shears and sat on the garden bench Harold had built for me after my first cancer scare 10 years ago. I said I wasn't destroying anything, I was protecting it. He asked from who? I answered from you. That seemed to catch him off guard, and there was a pause before he responded. He asked how I could say that, insisting he was trying to honor his father's memory and build on what he created. I said what he was actually trying to do was cash out as quickly as possible, so he and Brittany Cole could live a lifestyle they hadn't earned. I added that the buyer he found, Stewart Industries, was known for buying companies just to strip their assets and fire employees, and asked if he knew that. There was silence. I continued, asking if he knew they planned to close the Austin office and move operations to Mexico within 6 months, and that 43 families would have lost their jobs by Christmas. He tried to respond but stopped. I said he didn't ask, that he saw a large number and didn't think about what would happen to the people his father and I had spent 40 years building relationships with. I could hear Brittany Cole in the background speaking quickly, but I couldn't make out the words. He said the employees would find other jobs, though his voice lacked certainty. I reminded him about Evelyn Carrington, who had been our office manager for 18 years, now 56, and asked when he thought she would find another job like this. I mentioned Daniel Navarro, who had been with us since he was 22, whose daughter had just started college, and asked how he would pay for tuition after losing his job. He said business wasn't charity and sometimes people get hurt. I agreed, saying business isn't charity but it also isn't exploitation, and there is a difference between hard decisions and selfish ones. The conversation was briefly interrupted by voices in Italian, likely hotel staff. I could picture them standing in a luxury lobby, looking increasingly stressed as they tried to deal with the situation. He finally said they would be home tomorrow, and that they would settle everything properly. I said I looked forward to it. After the call ended, I remained in the garden for a long time, thinking about what had been said and what would happen next. I knew he would contact lawyers as soon as he returned, that he would try to challenge the trust and claim I had manipulated Harold. What he didn't know was that I had prepared for that as well. I took out my phone and called Marcus Reed again. He guessed immediately that they had discovered the situation in Milan. I confirmed it, adding that they were flying back the next day using Robert Hayes's money, and that Wade Sullivan was already talking about legal action. Marcus Reed chuckled and asked if I was ready for that too. I told him to pull all the recordings, the board meetings, family dinners, conversations in Harold's office. If Wade Sullivan wanted to claim manipulation, then we would show exactly what really happened. For the past 3 years, ever since Wade Sullivan started questioning my competence, I had been documenting everything. Not obviously but carefully, small recorders, phone recordings, office security footage. I had learned long ago that documentation was protection, especially for women in business, especially older women. Marcus Reed asked how much we had. I said enough, recordings of Wade Sullivan telling Harold I was confused, suggesting I should step back, discussing with Brittany Cole how to convince me to sell, and Harold's responses. I smiled, remembering how he defended me every time, explaining that I was behind most of our successful deals and telling Wade Sullivan that I was more capable than he realized. Marcus Reed said Wade Sullivan wouldn't expect that. I answered that Wade Sullivan had never expected much from me, and that had always been his weakness. That evening, I made a simple dinner and reviewed financial reports from our international divisions. Meridian Trust was not just holding assets, it was actively growing. While Wade Sullivan focused on the visible parts of the business, I had expanded into markets he never considered. Our partnership in Germany was generating more revenue than our entire Texas operation. Our licensing deals in Japan had doubled over the past 18 months. Our software patents were now used across 3 continents. Wade Sullivan believed he had sold the company for $2.8 million. In reality, he had sold only the least valuable part of something worth over $15 million. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It said this wasn't over and that I had made the biggest mistake of my life. I recognized it was from Brittany Cole. I replied that the biggest mistake of my life had been letting her into my family, and that I was correcting it now. She replied immediately that Wade Sullivan would never forgive me. I looked at the message for a moment and felt something settle inside me. Something like relief. I answered that maybe now we could finally have an honest relationship. After that, I turned off my phone and spent the evening reading. Harold had always said the best decisions come from a calm mind and a steady heart. Tomorrow would bring conflict and lawyers. But tonight, I wanted to enjoy the quiet of a house that finally felt like mine again. Around midnight, I walked through the rooms we had shared, the living room where we planned our first expansion, and the kitchen where we celebrated our biggest successes. The office where we had worked side by side, building something we were proud of. For 3 years, this house had felt like a mausoleum, a reminder of a man who was gone and a business I believed I had lost control of. Tonight it felt alive again. I stopped in front of the family photos lining the hallway, looking at Wade Sullivan as a child, then a teenager, then a young man just beginning his career. In every photo he was smiling, confident, surrounded by love and support. I had given him everything I could: education, opportunity, unconditional love, and a path to success. What I had failed to give him, it seemed, was respect for the people who had made all of that possible. Tomorrow he would learn what it felt like to lose that. And maybe if I was lucky, he would also learn what it took to earn it back. Wade Sullivan's rental car pulled into my driveway the following evening. I had been watching from the kitchen window, timing their arrival with the same precision I once used for international calls. They were 12 minutes later than expected, which likely meant they had argued on the drive from the airport. I didn't rush to answer the door when his familiar, impatient knock echoed through the house. Instead, I finished washing my dishes, dried my hands carefully, and adjusted my hair before walking slowly to the entryway. Through the glass, I could see them standing stiffly on the porch. When I opened the door, the difference in their appearance was obvious. Wade Sullivan's usually perfect suit was wrinkled from travel, his hair messy, and his eyes carried a desperate look I had never seen before. Brittany Cole looked worse, her makeup smeared, her clothes worn, and she clutched her purse tightly. He said they needed to talk, his voice controlled but tense. I told them to come in. We moved to the living room, the same place where everything had started just 4 days ago, though now the atmosphere had completely changed. Where Wade Sullivan once stood confidently, He now sat on the edge of the sofa, tense and uneasy. Brittany Cole sat beside him, her eyes moving around the room as if evaluating everything. He said he had brought his lawyer, who would arrive the next morning, and that they would challenge the trust. I answered calmly that they could try, but such challenges rarely succeed, especially with decades of documentation supporting them. Brittany Cole leaned forward, clearly losing composure, saying I couldn't do this to them, that they had plans and commitments. She admitted she had quit her job because she believed they would be secure for life. I raised an eyebrow and commented on that decision. Wade Sullivan added quietly that they had bought a house, expecting the money, and that the payment was due soon. I said that did sound like a problem and that poor planning often leads to such situations. At that point, Wade Sullivan's control broke. He accused me of taking what belonged to him. I calmly asked if that was really the case and took out a folder from the table beside me. I suggested we review what had actually belonged to him. I opened the folder and placed several documents on the table. They leaned forward, reading carefully. I explained that the first document was his father's will, showing what had been left to him. The company in its legal form at the time, including operations, contracts, and structure. Wade Sullivan grabbed the paper and read quickly, pointing out that he inherited 60%. I confirmed that was correct, 60% of the company as it existed 3 years ago. Then I showed another document, an amendment signed 18 months before his father's death, confirming that the most valuable assets had already been moved into separate entities. Brittany Cole reacted immediately, saying that was impossible. I clarified that nothing had been taken, only acknowledged. Those assets had always been mine. I explained that I had created the patents, negotiated the contracts, and acquired the properties. They had never been his father's to pass on. I watched Wade Sullivan's face as the realization settled in. Confusion turned to anger, then to a quieter understanding. He said I had planned this from the beginning. I answered that I had simply protected what I built. He stood up suddenly and began pacing, saying this was more than protection, that I had let him believe he was inheriting everything, watched him make plans and allowed him to fail. I answered calmly that I had given him exactly what his father had left him. If he chose to assume more without checking, that was not my responsibility. He repeated the words due diligence, his voice cracking slightly. He said I was his mother and that he trusted me. I asked if he really did because from where I sit, it looked like he trusted that I was too naive and too grief-stricken to notice what he was planning. I pulled out my phone and opened a voice recording I had saved from 8 months ago. Wade Sullivan's voice filled the room, quiet but clear from the phone's small speaker. He was saying that I had no idea what I was sitting on, that I thought the company was worth maybe $3 million at most, and that I had always been clueless about the financials. He said that once he convinced me to sell, they would have enough to buy that house and still have millions left. He added that I would probably be grateful enough to give them control over my personal accounts as well. The recording continued for another short moment, with Wade Sullivan laughing about how easy it would be to manipulate his scattered mother into making decisions that would benefit him. Brittany Cole's face went pale as she asked where I got that. I told her that Wade Sullivan made that call from her kitchen last December while I was visiting. She had stepped out, and he thought I was in the bathroom, but I was actually just around the corner with my phone. Wade Sullivan sank back onto the sofa, holding his head, and said I had been recording them. I corrected him, saying I had been protecting myself, something I learned during 40 years of being underestimated by men who thought they were smarter than me. I pulled out another phone and played a second recording, this one from Wade Sullivan's conversation with his father 6 months before Harold's death. In it, Wade Sullivan said he was worried about me, that I seemed confused about basic business concepts, and that maybe it was time to transition me into an advisory role while he handled operations. Harold's response was clear. He said I had forgotten more about business than Wade Sullivan had learned, and that if Wade Sullivan thought I was confused, then he simply wasn't paying attention. He added that I had been outperforming competitors half my age while Wade Sullivan was focused on office politics. Wade Sullivan argued that fresh perspectives might be valuable, and that some of my ideas seemed outdated. Harold laughed and said I had just closed a $2 million international deal while Wade Sullivan was complaining about coffee in the break room, and that he should focus on developing himself instead. When the recording ended, Wade Sullivan looked physically ill. Brittany Cole stared at him, shocked, saying he had told her I was losing my mind and that doctors were concerned about early dementia. Wade Sullivan tried to deny it, but she insisted he had said exactly that. I calmly explained that there had never been any medical concerns, and that my last cognitive assessment 4 months ago showed no signs of decline. Brittany Cole turned to Wade Sullivan with clear disgust, and said he had lied about everything. He tried to defend himself, saying he was trying to protect their future. I finished the thought for him, saying he believed he could take from his own mother and justify it. Then I asked what he planned to do next. He said he would contest the trust, hire the best lawyers, and prove I had manipulated his father. I asked with what money, reminding him his cards didn't work and that Robert Hayes had only paid for the tickets, not a legal battle against trusts built over 30 years. He said he would figure something out. I agreed that he could, or he could accept reality and decide what kind of relationship he wanted moving forward. Brittany Cole stood up abruptly and said she wasn't staying, telling him to fix it or she was done. She walked out, her heels hitting the floor sharply. Wade Sullivan started after her, then stopped and turned back to me. He asked what I wanted from him, his voice breaking. I told him I wanted him to decide whether he loved me or just what he thought I could give him, because one of those has a future and the other does not. He looked at me for a long moment, then walked out without another word. I watched through the window as they argued beside the car before driving away. About 20 minutes later my phone rang. Wade Sullivan. He said he needed a place to stay because Brittany Cole had thrown him out. I said the spare room was available, but the rent would be $50 a night and he would need to help around the house. He said he didn't have $50. I told him he would need to figure out how to earn it. There was a long pause. He asked if I was really going to make him homeless. I said I was going to let him experience what independence looks like when you don't have a safety net. I told him to consider it an education and personal responsibility. He said he was my son. Yes, I said. And it was time he learned what that actually meant. 6 months later I stood in the kitchen making coffee for two. A routine that had become as natural as breathing. The morning sun streamed through windows that sparkled. Wade Sullivan had cleaned them the day before as part of his weekly responsibilities. The house had never looked better or felt more peaceful. Wade Sullivan appeared in the doorway, dressed in jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his hair still damp from the shower. The designer suits were long gone, sold months earlier to help pay for basic necessities. He greeted me and I greeted him back. He asked how I had slept. I answered and he said he had slept better than he had in years. He moved to the cabinet and pulled out 2 mugs, something that had become automatic. He said he had finished reviewing the quarterly reports the night before. The German partnership was exceeding projections by 18%. I smiled and handed him his coffee black, the way he had learned to drink it when expensive coffee makers and creamers were no longer in the budget. I added that the Tokyo expansion contracts should be finalized by the end of the month, and that his instincts about the timing were right. It had taken Wade Sullivan 3 months to stop being bitter about working for his mother instead of inheriting the company. It had taken another 2 months for him to realize he was learning more than he ever had before. The transformation had not been easy or smooth. After Brittany Cole left him at the hotel that night, Wade Sullivan had spent 2 weeks sleeping on friends' couches, trying to borrow money for lawyers to challenge the trust. One by one, his friends stopped answering his calls when they realized he had no way to pay them back. His uncle refused to fund a legal battle after confirming the trust documents were solid. Wade Sullivan finally showed up at my door 3 weeks later, exhausted and humbled, asking if the spare room was still available. He said he would pay $50 a night and do the housework, that he just needed somewhere to stay while he figured out what came next. I told him that what came next was up to him, but if he stayed, he would follow my rules. The rules were simple and not negotiable. No drinking, no drugs, no overnight guests without permission, rent paid weekly in advance, and responsibilities completed without complaint. Most importantly, if he wanted to be part of the business again, He would start at the bottom and work his way up based on merit. I said I had a meeting that afternoon and asked if he wanted to sit in. His eyes lit up. He said they were one of our biggest potential clients. I said they were also difficult to work with and that he might learn something by observing. 6 months earlier he would have resisted that idea. Now he agreed immediately and asked how to prepare. I told him to review their file, study their previous partnerships, and think about their concerns. He said he had already done that and showed me his notes. I felt a familiar warmth in my chest. The same feeling I had when he was 8 years old and spent hours building something carefully and perfectly. For a long time I had lost that version of him. I was glad to see it returning. I told him I was proud of how hard he had been working. He looked surprised and asked if I really meant that. I said I did. I explained that when he first came back I wasn't sure why he was there, but now it was clear he was changing. He admitted that at first it was because he had nowhere else to go. His face reddened slightly as he said that. He said he had spent those weeks planning how to prove me wrong and get back what he thought was his. But then he realized that what he thought was his had never really been his at all. He set down his coffee and looked directly at me. He said he had wasted the first 35 years of his life trying to live up to an image that wasn't real. He said he believed being a man meant taking what he wanted and never asking for help. He thought strength meant never admitting he was wrong. I asked what he thought now. He said his father had been successful because he respected the right person and listened. He said he had missed years of learning because of his own arrogance. At that moment my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I hadn't seen in months. Brittany Cole. Wade Sullivan saw the name and became tense. He asked if I was going to answer. I said I was curious what she wanted after all this time. I answered the call. She greeted me, her voice quieter than I remembered. I said it was fine. I asked what I could do for her. She said she was wondering if Wade Sullivan was there because she had been trying to reach him, but his number had been disconnected. I glanced at Wade Sullivan, who was shaking his head. I said he was here and asked if she would like to speak with him. She said she actually wanted to speak with me first and that she had something to say. Wade Sullivan raised his eyebrows but didn't object when I put the phone on speaker. She said she owed me an apology, a big one, and that she had been wrong about me and wrong to encourage Wade Sullivan to do what he did. I asked what had changed her mind. She said life with a bitter laugh. She explained that after leaving Wade Sullivan in Austin, she moved back in with her parents and had been job hunting for 6 months, and that it had been humbling. She said she had forgotten what it was like to actually work for things instead of expecting them to be handed to her. I said I understood. She added that she had also had time to think about their marriage and about the person she had been with, Wade Sullivan. She said she didn't like that person. She said she had been entitled and greedy, and too comfortable with the idea of taking advantage of someone who had only loved and supported their child. Wade Sullivan was staring at the phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. She said she had called to apologize, but also to tell Wade Sullivan something important, that the divorce papers were being filed that week. She said she wasn't asking for anything except her personal belongings, and that she didn't deserve anything more. Wade Sullivan spoke quietly, but she continued, saying she needed to say this. She said he had made mistakes, but she had made them worse. She said she pushed him to see his mother as an obstacle instead of an ally. She said she convinced him that taking advantage of her was justified. She said she was ashamed and that she was sorry. After she hung up, Wade Sullivan and I sat in silence for several minutes. I asked how he felt. He said he felt relieved, sad but relieved. He said the person he had been during that marriage was not someone he liked. He looked around the kitchen at the simple breakfast and the honest work waiting for us. He said he felt like he was becoming someone his father would have been proud of. I told him his father had always been proud of him, but had wanted him to be proud of himself too. That afternoon, the meeting with the Henderson group went better than I expected. Wade Sullivan asked thoughtful questions, took detailed notes, and showed he had prepared well. When they asked about succession planning, I pointed to Wade Sullivan as Director of Operations, a role he had earned through 6 months of hard work. After the clients left, we sat in the conference room reviewing everything. He said he thought they would sign. I said I thought so too and that he had done excellent work. He smiled, then became serious and asked me something. He asked if, when I set up the trust, I knew it would end like this, with him learning the business properly. I considered the question carefully. I said I hoped it would, but I had also been prepared for the possibility that he would walk away and never speak to me again. He asked what I would have done then. I said I would have continued running the company until I couldn't anymore, and then sold it to someone responsible. I paused and said I would have missed him every day. His eyes filled with tears. He said he was sorry for putting me through that. I told him he didn't make me choose, he made his own choice, and I simply made sure it had consequences. He asked what would have happened if he had kept fighting. I said he would have learned that respect cannot be inherited or taken. It must be earned. He nodded slowly and said he was starting to understand that. As we packed up, he turned to me and thanked me. I asked for what? He said for not giving up on him and for showing him who he could become. I smiled and said that's what mothers do. We love enough to let our children fail, and enough to help them succeed. Even when they call us a burden, especially then, because that's when they need it most. 6 months ago, I thought I was losing my son. Instead, I found him, the real version of him beneath everything else, the man we had always hoped he would become. It took losing everything for him to understand what truly mattered. And it took risking everything for me to protect what mattered most. As we walked out of the office together, I realized that this was what victory really looked like, not proving you are right, but reaching the moment when everyone understands what was worth fighting for. Now I'm curious about you. What would you do in my place? Have you ever experienced something similar? Leave your thoughts below. And on the final screen there are 2 more stories you might enjoy. Thank you for watching until the end.